Hello and welcome to Just One More Watch. Welcome to another Versus today, another head-to-head 10-round watch boxing special, and it's a bit of a grudge match between Seiko and Orient. Though quite how much of a grudge match that actually is, considering they're both owned by the same parent company, is up for debate. Perhaps sibling rivalry would be more appropriate. Now, I have put Seiko head-to-head against Orient before a few years ago with dive watches when I compared the SKX to the Mako 2. Today it's military-style field watches in the form of the Seiko SRPG, their relatively new Seiko 5 field watch release, versus the relatively recently upgraded Orient Defender 2. Now, when I reviewed the Seiko a couple of months back, I proclaimed it to be the best field watch under $200. Is its tenure at the top short-lived? Will the Orient be wresting that particular crown from its head? Let's flip the camera and find out. Alright, let's start with a quick look at today's protagonists. The Seiko 5 SRPG 27 on the left and the Orient Defender 2 on the right. Don't ask me what the model reference is for that one. Similar but slightly different, I admit, today. Both field watches, but with a slight pilot style twist to both of them, I think. The Seiko perhaps the more traditional field watch because it does have two prominent rings of Arabics, one all the way up to 24. There is a whiff of pilot though with the triangle up there at 12 o'clock. The Orient is a little more pilot style, but it does have a dedicated 24-hour indicator, the sub-register down there at the 4 o'clock. So both of them definitely have a military flavour today. That's why they're going head to head. So onto the scoring system then. It's not rocket science. I'm sure you've seen it here or elsewhere by now. 10 categories, each with a maximum score of 10. However, I have double weighted two of them. Today they are movement and brand, giving a total maximum potential score of 120. I will then turn that into percentage so you get an idea not only of where these two watches sit against each other, but where they sit on a general scale of 1 to 100. Let's start as I always do with movement, which always tends to add a little bit of context. Let's start with movement then. The Seiko gets a very solid 8 doubled to 16, but the Orient takes an early lead with a super strong 9. Now, I don't mean it's almost the best movement you can buy in the entire world. I mean it's almost the best movement you can expect in a Japanese big brand watch that costs less than $200. So the Seiko has a 4R36. I'm sure you're all familiar with this one. 24 jewel hacking and hand winding auto. Absolutely rock solid. Stated tolerances of -20 to 40 seconds plus per day. They generally run pretty much in the middle of that. I usually find plus 10 seconds per day. The movement hand winds and it hacks, and I actually really enjoy the fact that it has a day-date complication on the dial as well. You don't get much better than that for your money, hence the 8. As good as the Seiko 4R movement is, I think you just get a little bit more for your money today with the Orient in terms of movement, hence the 9. The Orient contains the F6B22. Now, I don't have a photo of that exact movement, but you can pretty much guarantee it looks quite like this one. It's in-house just like the Seikos, but this one is made in Japan, whereas the Seiko movements, as far as I'm aware, are made in Malaysia. The Orient movement also hand winds, and I have to say it is grittier than the Seikos. It also hacks. It has a date complication. It has 2 extra hands though, one of which displays the day of the week. This hand is the one that's justifying the extra point though. That is a 24-hour indicator. An extra complication, 5 hands plus date, on a watch costing this little money, that I think is worth 9 out of 10. Segueing relatively neatly into price, and here the Orient continues to not march ahead but step gently ahead. 8 out of 10 for the Seiko, 9 out of 10 for the Orient. I checked ebay.com, the cheapest Seiko SRPG that I could find was this blue one at $180. Various colours are available. As far as this price category is concerned, it doesn't matter which version I find cheapest. $180 for the Seiko, I think that's pretty good value, 8 out of 10. But not as good value as the Orient, $165 for the green one I've got here. From memory, I bought both of these watches myself. There was about 50 Aussie dollars between the two, so yeah, maybe I paid a little more for the Seiko comparatively speaking. That is a good price, 165 for a field watch, again with 5 hands and 2 complications on the dial. Not bad value at all. Next category, case finish, and once again the Orient continues to pull out a bit of a lead. 7 for the Seiko, 8 for the Orient. Not that there's anything wrong with the Seiko, and it does score an extra point for the drilled lugs, but it loses that point again because it has a very plain unsigned crown. I do like the finish on the bezel, a nice circular brush there, but it is a very plain, high polish finish to either side of the case, which is going to scratch and scuff more and just looks a bit ordinary. 7 out of 10. The Orient gets an 8, not just because it has the Orient logo there on a nicer, grippier crown. Bezel's also pretty good, just generally the case finishing here feels a notch up when compared to the Seiko, all brushed throughout and it's a nice fine brushing. It's actually pretty good for a watch costing this price, 8 out of 10. So the Orient has a fairly solid lead at the moment, but next category, dial and hands, brings things just about level again. A very good 9 for the Seiko, not quite so good 6 for the Orient. Now that is a good looking field watch. A very, very good looking field watch. Applied Arabics 1 to 12, applied indices beyond that as well, applied Seiko logo, beautifully brushed handset there, day-date complication with a printed frame around it. All the rest of the printing is really nicely done. Nice automatic script above that index at 6 there. The whole thing well proportioned, well balanced. It looks like a junior Hamilton Interstellar if you are familiar with that watch. That is a bit of an accolade. It is a great looking watch for less than $200. The Orient, on the other hand, perhaps not quite so great looking. It scored extra points for those complications, but it loses them again because of what they do to the dial. It loses all sense of symmetry. The Orient logo kind of wedged in there between 1 and 2, and those two, again, slightly awkwardly placed sub-registers. It's still nice and legible, those are applied indices, and it's a good looking handset, but it isn't as nicely colour matched as the Seiko was, and just generally looks a little bit awkward, 6 out of 10. Moving on to crystal. Now, sadly, sapphire is a bit of a rarity from the big Japanese brands at or around this $200 price point, so unfortunately both have mineral. However, I think the Seiko's mineral crystal is only worth a 6, whereas the Orient's gets an 8. Seiko have made what I think is a slightly unusual choice by fitting a piece of domed Hardlex crystal to this field watch. Now, Hardlex is Seiko's own proprietary mineral crystal. You get a lot of flecto with this one, and you do get considerable amounts of distortion at the edges of the viewing angle. Not something you really want with a field watch, I don't think. Here's the Seiko outside natural light, and you can see a considerable amount of flecto from that dial at this angle, and it is consistently bad regardless of what you do. Not ideal for a field watch, I don't think. The Orient uses a piece of very ordinary flat mineral crystal. I assume this is considerably cheaper for them to do than the domed Hardlex crystal fitted to the Seiko, but it just works far better, I think. No distortion at the edges of the viewing angle. You get a nice clean read on those hands at all times. And this is the Orient in exactly the same position as the Seiko was outside, and no flecto. Generally a more suitable piece of mineral crystal, even if it isn't quite as fancy. It gets an 8 as opposed to the Seiko 6. Next category, bit of a quickie, water resistance. Both score quite well. Seiko gets a 7 because it has 100 meters of water resistance. Orient gets a 9 because it has 100 meters of water resistance and a screw down crown. I wasn't expecting that. That, to me anyway, is worth 2 points over a non-screw down crown, just for the psychological factor, just for the sheer peace of mind you get with a screw down crown that I don't think you get with a push-pull crown. Moving swiftly on to Lume then, and more points in favour of the Orient. Seiko gets a 6, kind of middle of the road. Orient, quite a reasonable 8 out of 10. Both present well initially, both having plenty of lume on the hands and all of the indices as well. Both adopting similar tones. They've gone for a kind of green look. Seiko's Lume Bright, and who knows what Orient use on their watches. If I crank the speed up though, you can see that the indices on the Seiko disappear all too quickly, whereas the indices on the Orient are still going strong towards the end of the 20-minute test period. Right at the end, if I slow it down again, hands are pretty much comparable, but the Orient gets an extra 2 points because of those indices. That's not bad at all, to be honest. But let's come back to earth with a bit of a bump and discuss the bracelets. You don't generally get a lot of bracelet for this price, and you're not getting it in this case. 6 out of 10 for the Seiko, 5 out of 10 for the Orient. It's a bit of a shocker. I should point out that neither of the two bracelets are uncomfortable or anything. They're just technically not particularly fantastic. All brushed finish on the Seiko one. It's push pins on both watches, but hollow end links here and a cheap nasty press clasp. 2 holes of micro adjust, which is just not enough, and both of these watches have that problem. The Seiko gets an extra point though, because it does have that security fold over with the double pushers and Seiko stamped in the top, while the Orient clasp is even more rudimentary. Not fantastic. Again, only 2 holes of micro adjust, everything's cheap and pressed, everything's hollow, everything's a bit rattly. 5 out of 10. Now I try and keep these categories fairly objective, but inevitably a little bit of subjectivity creeps into the last two. Brand, which I usually double weight, and X Factor, which is my own personal catch-all. It's a bit of a Jody's choice. Anything I feel deserves extra emphasis on either timepiece. Brand, Seiko, very strong at this price, 8 out of 10, double to 16. Orient, still not bad, 7 out of 10, double to 14. I think Seiko is just about the best brand you can put on your wrist for less than $200, hence it consistently scores well in all of these tests when brand is a category. Orient, not bad though. Sister brand, cousin brand, whatever you want to call it. The Defender as a model has a good reputation, and I think Orient makes some great models around this one. The Bambino, the Komatsu, the Meiko, the Ray, etc, etc. They've got a bit of cachet at this price, but just not as much as their bigger brother Seiko. And finally, X Factor, the category where I get to re-emphasize anything I don't think has been awarded sufficient points prior to this point. X Factor, 8 for the Seiko, 7 for the Orient. The Seiko gets a strong score because I think it is a good looking watch. Double applied indices all the way around, colour matched day and date wheel, far nicer handset, and it also comes from a very strong line of Seiko 5 field watches. The Orient not far behind though, thanks to those additional complications, again stressing those. Japanese, in-house Japanese made automatic with extra sub-registers, not to be sniffed at this price, but still not quite as good as that handsome Seiko, 7 out of 10. So then, where does that leave us? Can I get a drum roll, please? I only declared that Seiko to be the best field watch you could buy for less than $200 a couple of months ago. Do we have a new winner? Yes, we do. But not by much. Bloody close today, only 3 points in it. 89 out of 120 for the Seiko, 92 out of 120 for the Orient. Rounded up, fairly strong scores in the mid-70s, 74% for the Seiko, 77% for the Orient. Now obviously these are my scores. You are welcome to adjust this as you see fit. If you take your watches off before going near a sink, water resistance probably not all that important to you. Whereas if after dark legibility is a massive factor, or outside legibility is a massive factor, you should consider those categories more than the others. One thing I haven't really talked about today is size. This one comes in at 39 with 20 lugs. This is a 42 with 22mm lugs. I'm assuming that most people can get away with either, but then again it is down to personal preference, which is why I didn't include it in here. It would just have been too subjective. So yes, we have a new winner today. The Orient Defender 2 is the best field watch you can buy for less than $200 until somebody leaves me a comment telling me there's something better and I bring it in and compare it to the Orient Defender 2. Strong scores from both watches today. A lot of 7s, a lot of 8s, a couple of 9s on the table. That's pretty good considering that these are budget watches. I think both of these will do a job consistently and reliable for you for the long term. There's not too much to choose between the two brands. It does come down to the looks. As I said at the beginning, there's similarities, but there are also some considerable differences. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you agree with my scorecard, or would you be picking one or the other, and why? So there you have it. It's the Orient by a nose. We have a new best field watch under $200, and it is the Orient Defender 2. Nothing wrong with that Seiko though, especially if you prefer a smaller watch. Why not make yourself a cup of tea and watch both full reviews? Thanks for watching this one. I'll see you again soon.